You are alive right now because someone made it through the worst cold the Earth has known in hundreds of thousands of years. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Every single human being on this planet, every person reading a screen, every child being born today, every old man sitting in the sun, is descended from a group of people who survived something most species did not. About 20,000 to 26,000 years ago, the Earth hit a point called the Last Glacial Maximum. That's the peak of the last ice age, the coldest it got, the most ice that existed. Global temperatures were 6 to 8 degrees Celsius colder than today. That doesn't sound like much until you think about what it actually means on the ground. Ice sheets stretched across most of North America, across most of Europe, across the northern half of Asia. In some places, those ice sheets were 3 kilometers thick. You could stack 9 Empire State Buildings on top of each other and still not reach the surface. The landscape that modern humans now call home, New York, London, Stockholm, Moscow, was buried under ice. And yet, people were alive, people were surviving. How? About 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano called Toba erupted in what is now Sumatra, Indonesia. It was one of the largest eruptions in the last 2 million years. The ash and sulfur it released into the atmosphere blocked sunlight across the planet for years, maybe decades. Temperatures dropped, ecosystems collapsed, food sources disappeared, and human population, already small by any modern standard, may have crashed to as few as 10,000 to 40,000 individuals. 10,000 people, that's a medium-sized town. That's less than the capacity of many university stadiums. When scientists look at the DNA of every human alive today, they find an unusual lack of genetic diversity. We are, as a species, far more genetically similar to each other than other great apes are to members of their own species. Chimps in the same forest are more genetically different from each other than a Norwegian farmer is from a Papua New Guinean fisherman. That sameness, that genetic bottleneck, points to a moment when almost everyone died. We survived that, barely. And then the real cold came. So what did survival actually look like? It looked like a needle.
It looked like this.
The oldest bone needles ever found were discovered in Siberia, dating back roughly 50,000 years. A bone needle, a small, sharp, pierced piece of bone. Sewn clothing wraps around the body. It traps air. It creates insulation. A fitted fur garment in minus 20 degrees Celsius does what a draped skin cannot. The people who figured that out lived. The ones who didn't, or the ones who didn't have access to that knowledge, died. This is someone, somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, sitting in a cave and figuring out how to push thread through a hole in bone. In the coldest regions, there were no forests to harvest, no wood to build with, so people built with what was available, mammoth bones. Archaeologists in Ukraine and Russia have found the remnants of structures built from hundreds of mammoth bones, skulls, femurs, tusks, arranged into frameworks, then covered with hides. Some were large enough for multiple families. Some show evidence of central hearths, meaning organized interior fire management. They were following the herds, moving with migrations of mammoth, reindeer, bison, because a sedentary life in a barren, frozen landscape meant starvation. Mobility was survival. Ice Age people buried meat in the permafrost to preserve it. They were thinking ahead, planning across seasons. During the last glacial maximum, so much of the world's water was locked up in ice sheets that sea levels were 120 to 130 meters lower than today. A stretch of territory between what is now Siberia and what is now Alaska, today the Bering Strait, an ocean passage, became a land bridge, a wide, flat, grassy plain called Beringia, hundreds of kilometers wide, not a narrow crossing, a continent-connecting corridor. Humans walked from Asia to North America, on land, dry land. That migration populated an entire hemisphere. the Americas, every single indigenous nation, every ancient civilization from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, traces back to people who walked across Beringia during or before the last glacial maximum. During the worst of the Ice Age, during the peak cold when survival was hardest, humans were making art. The paintings at Lascaux in France, the images at Altamira in Spain, horses, bison, aurochs, handprints pressed against stone. These were not made after the Ice Age, they were made during it. The Gravettian people, who lived roughly 30,000 to 22,000 years ago, right through the worst of the cold, developed sophisticated stone tools, worked ivory into jewelry and figurines. These people were not in pure survival mode, they were thinking, creating, expressing something that went beyond the immediate problem of staying warm. It's not just calories and shelter, it's meaning, community, shared language and shared story, the ability to pass knowledge, not just through demonstration, but through symbol. The Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago. They had survived ice ages before. They were physically adapted to cold, stockier, more robust, with larger nasal passages suited to warming cold air. They used fire. They buried their dead. There is evidence they cared for their injured. They were not primitive brutes. They were people. But they didn't make it. We did. Why? There are theories. Maybe it was interbreeding, and there was interbreeding. About 2 to 4% of the DNA of most non-African humans today is Neanderthal. But one theory that keeps gaining evidence is this: social networks. Anatomically modern humans appear to have maintained contact and trade across vast distances. Shells found far from coastlines. Flint from sources hundreds of kilometers away, ochre moved across regions. When one group's food source collapsed, another group could help. When one region developed a better tool or technique, that knowledge could travel. Neanderthals appear to have lived in smaller, more isolated groups. When something went wrong, there was no network to absorb the loss. Connectivity was survival. The Ice Age ended around 11,700 years ago. Temperatures rose, ice sheets retreated, sea levels climbed back up. Beringia disappeared underwater. And within a few thousand years, humans started farming. The Neolithic Revolution, the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture, happened almost immediately after the ice retreated, as if, once the constraint was lifted, everything that had been building, the knowledge, the social organization, the capacity to plan across seasons, finally had the conditions to express itself fully. You are descended from the survivors. Not in a motivational poster sense, in a literal biological sense. Every human alive today is the product of an unbroken chain of people who made it through Toba, through the last glacial maximum, through the long cold dark when the ice was 3 kilometers thick and the nearest humans you could trade with were a week's walk away. They made needles. They built houses from bones. They fed their children and carried their knowledge forward and painted horses on cave walls. And then they taught their children, who taught theirs. All the way to you.
All the way to you.
If they could build art and culture and social networks in a world covered in ice, with none of what we have now, what exactly is the excuse for failing to maintain what they handed us? That's not a rhetorical question, that's the actual question. Think about it.